Die Grenzwacht hielt im Osten, dem Feinde lange stand. Heut kehrt ihr letzter Posten zurück ins Vaterland.
All right, welcome to episode 6 of History Music Podcast. This is your host, Scott Gifford, and I'm joined here with Sean Oborn. How you doing, Sean?
Hey, man. Officially the co-host now, right?
Yeah. Yes, you are officially the co-host. Welcome. I'll send you your official co-host stuff later.
Thanks, man. I'm still waiting for that royalty check too.
Yeah. You officially get a percentage of the cut here.
Nice.
Throw some pennies at him.
What was that?
Just throw some pennies at him for his royalty.
Yeah.
Yes.
In fact, do you know what? Now that you're officially co-host, you can actually help fund the podcast. So,
oh, nice.
It actually goes the other way.
Tax-deductible donation can help build the podcast.
Yep. We're also joined here by Nim. How you doing, Nim?
I'm doing great. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for being here, man. It's a pleasure to have you on. Really, we've been going back and forth trying to get this episode going for a while, and I'm glad it's finally happening.
Yeah. Me too.
Yeah, and for those that don't know, they're listening at home, Nim is actually a highly esteemed podcast guest. Ironside Podcast, Spiritual Arson, I mean, you name it, he's been on it. So we're thrilled to have you here, man.
It's a pleasure. All the cultivation of all my podcast work has led me to this moment.
We're very flattered.
Dude, our listener will be so happy to hear you.
It's an honor for them to listen to such a esteemed philosopher.
And published author.
Yeah, published author as well.
The esteemed author of The Nim Stack is here with us. It's pretty big deal.
Yeah, you've heard of it for sure. So Nim, tell us a little bit about yourself, man, before we get into the song.
I am a frog on Twitter, and I run the Nim Stack. The Nim Stack is my Substack where I post my historical findings and philosophical thoughts for everyone to enjoy, and that's what I do.
Can I ask a question about the Nim Stack?
You can ask as many questions about the Nim Stack as you'd like.
Beautiful. So I've read through several of your articles. They're all very well done. My question, and something I just thought of, what was it that originally inspired you to start the Nim Stack or start writing and publishing it for all to see?
I just had things that I wanted to say, and Substack seemed like a good format to say it, where I didn't particularly like the Twitter format because I had to keep things short and concise. Substack allowed me to sort of expand my thoughts, and that's where the Nim Stack came in. And then also there was research that I wanted to do on historical topics like this that I wanted to publish, and the Nim Stack was the medium for that.
Yeah, I've noticed. I mean, you mentioned you're a frog on Twitter, and that comes with some like, I guess, preconceived notions and
some baggage. But
what I'm bringing up, or why I bring that up, is it seems like on your Substack you're in a different headspace. It's a different outlet for you compared to your Twitter persona, I suppose. Is that intentional?
Well, I use frog sort of ironically.
Yeah, for sure.
It's different. The medium is just different. The things people expect from you on those different sites are different, so you act differently. It's like you talk to your friends differently than the way you talk to your parents, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, those different contexts just make you speak a little differently.
I thoroughly enjoy your Twitter feed. It's great.
Thanks.
But I equally enjoy the Nim Stack. From what I've read, I haven't read all of it. You're pretty prolific. Yeah, but it's been fun to see kind of the more scholarly side of you, I suppose you'd say. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad people get to see that side of me. Know that I'm more than just a guy on Twitter.
Right. Yeah, and that's I kind of feel like that's kind of how this podcast has turned out a little bit for both Sean and I. We're trying to do something a little that will be beyond us, beyond our kind of silly Twitter thing, you know.
Well, it's a way for us to kind of show our more serious side. Although I don't like being serious, so I have a hard
Yeah,
time with it. But
we don't necessarily have to be like on all the time. We don't have to be like trying to crack jokes this whole podcast. But if a joke comes to your head, we're not like a stuffy podcast, you know.
Yeah, these long format projects like Substacks and podcasts have become modern equivalents of Kleoses, which is like the Greek word for eternal glory I've sort of written about a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Because you sort of more or less probably don't want people in like 500 years to remember you by your Twitter. But you wouldn't mind if they remembered you by these podcasts and these Substacks that we're all doing now. So this is like the modern way to cement yourself into eternity now.
Yeah, that's kind of true.
I disagree. I actually everything I tweet, I imagine it being argued about in like whatever the version of the Agora is in like 1,000 years. But maybe you can do what you want. I guess.
Yeah, if you can make your Kleos whatever you want. Actually, that's sort of the cool thing about it.
Yeah, they'll be arguing in 1,000 years. So what did he actually mean when he said based here? Based on what, like when he said it there?
Yeah. Theories in the meaning of red pilled. So another NIMStack question, Nim, and you can answer this however you want to. So I know you mentioned earlier that you were kind of doing some of your own research and your own thoughts that you had, and that's sort of what inspired you to start the NIMStack in the first place. Talking about the research part that you mentioned, do you have like a method for how you research stuff or the topics you are researching? Like, is it for a class you're doing? Is it just like thoughts that come into your head? Like, hey, I want to research, World War I Germany or whatever. Is it, how do you approach like what you're researching or what you're going to write about?
It's not really that complicated. I find a subject that that just interests me, and I go from there. So in the case of the Baltic Freikorps, I saw that there wasn't as much research out there or at least accessible research out there as I would like there to be. So I decided that I would do it, and that's pretty much it. And sort of everything else that I read or write about, it's just sort of because I want to and I find interest in it.
Cool. I like that. Follow your interests.
Well, and sometimes that's kind of why we do this podcast in the first place is, I mean, how many people are out there like, I can't find the content I want to consume. I guess I'll have to make it myself.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very, very common occurrence. That's kind of what Scott and I are doing now. So now, Nim, have you read Ernst von Solomon's The Outlaws?
I have read excerpts of it.
Okay, cool. Yep, I have it. I own it. It's on my to read list, but I have not cracked it open yet. But I hear it's very good.
Yeah, from the excerpts that I've read, it's really good. I've had to read excerpts of it for some of my research. I do plan on completing it soon.
So,
cool.
As far as your studies into the history revolving around this song with the Freikorps and stuff, what's your long-term goal with it?
The long-term goal are books, pretty much. That includes original translations of interwar texts and also articles and essays on the interwar period, which I've sort of already started with the NIMStack.
Do you like aspire to be like a top mind in that realm of history?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say that. The aspiration sort of becomes a necessity, kind of, because there's not a whole lot of other people doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you do it for not even that long, you sort of get there anyway. But yeah, the getting as competent as I can about this period of history is sort of the goal, because I think a lot can be learned about this period of history where everything sort of just falls apart, on the European continent.
Mm-hmm. So have you found anybody else other than you that you've like been in contact with personally about this?
I have. Yes.
Nice.
We are working on stuff.
That's cool. Is that all you can tell us?
It's all I can tell you for now. Big
Okay.
things are on the way. Subscribe to the NIM stack to stay updated.
That's awesome. That's awesome to hear.
A teaser. I like it.
A little change of pace from the kind of the history stuff. What's because this is like a music podcast. What's your taste in music other than like German folk songs?
Yeah. When I was younger, it used to be a lot of EDM.
Okay.
And as I've, over the past probably 4 years or so, that's transformed into emo rap and other types of, I guess you might call indie rap or trap rap. That's mostly what I listen to right now.
Okay. Any artists you suggest?
Yeah, I mean, there's always the classics. You could always go for Juice World or Lil Peep.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you start there, you'll find yourself in a good place eventually.
Nice.
And that's actually kind of, speaking of music, that's sort of how we got connected. That's kind of how we all know each other, is we're all sort of Twitter mutuals. But yet again, Nim is another member of the Bob the Duck music discussion chat that Scott and
That's
I
right.
first met on, that Brett Kane was also in.
Yeah.
Right.
Not bring up Bob the Duck's chat challenge impossible. Right.
Yeah, because everyone, all of our guests are from that chat. So we got to get Bob on here, man, because he's like kind of inspired this whole thing.
Yeah.
But,
That'll be like
that's
the
kind of
culmination of the podcast is having Bob on.
be our season finale. Have him on here and basically tell us our taste of music sucks and get out of the chat.
Yeah.
That needs to be your final episode. No more episodes after that. So
Yeah.
you really gotta keep that one in the back pocket for
That's
now.
true. You gotta build up.
Yeah. Well, hey, so the song we're talking about today in German is called Die Grenzwacht hielt im Osten.
Mm-hmm.
So, Nim, this one is outside both of Scott and I's wheelhouse. So, tell us a little bit about the background of the song, not necessarily the lyrics yet, but the background of the song, the historical context behind it, and why you picked it.
So this song was written by Karl von Manteuffel-Katzengen, and he was a Baltic German aristocrat. The inspiration for this song and for his entire musical career, or poetry rather, was that in 1905 there was a first Russian Revolution that failed. But during that revolution, there were independence movements in the Baltics, and in Kurland specifically, a lot of the Baltic Germans experienced the wrath of those revolutionary movements, and they pretty much destroyed the property of the Baltic barons. And Manteuffel himself had his estate burned down by the revolutionaries. After the revolution was put down, he began reconstruction of his house, and in that he says he found a lot of joy. And that became the beginning for his musical career. This song specifically is about returning to Riga after they've had to leave. Most of the Baltic barons, or which was what the Baltic aristocrats were called at that time, most of the Baltic barons eventually had to leave the Baltics, and they spent since 1905 throughout the to the 1940s. They spent planning their return, but ultimately it never happened.
Yeah, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there were some that did return,
Yeah.
but then during this whole, it was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Nazi Germany and communist, Soviet Russia. They kind of agreed to this whole like spheres of influence, and so
Mhm.
Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland was considered, like, Germany sort of gave that, quote unquote, gave that sphere of influence to Soviet Russia. And because of this secret pact they signed, any Baltic Germans that did return had to basically sort of be kind of forcibly sent back to Germany, against their will. Right? Is that
So after the 1905 revolution, a lot of them returned at the beginning of the First World War because they thought that Germany had retaken the Baltics and they could go back. But after that failed, a lot of them had to leave again. The being Russian wasn't necessarily a problem for them, because even before during the 1905 revolution, that part of the area was Russia, and most of the Baltic barons considered themselves Russians in an empirical sense, not necessarily an ethnic identity as a peasant one, but they believed that they were part of the Russian Empire, and that created a lot of problems for them. But they had no problems being within the Russian Empire. Most of them spoke Russian, in addition to their native German. After the fall of Riga on May 22nd, 1919, when the Freikorps were forced to evacuate, yeah, not a whole lot of Baltic barons remained within the area, and actually a lot, the ones who did remain, a lot of them ended up in camps eventually.
I think it's important to point out too that Baltic Germans was a distinct German identity
Yeah,
for hundreds of years
yeah,
until this time period.
right.
Like Courland is an area that we don't call it Courland anymore. Excuse me. It's basically just a part of Latvia that borders the Baltic Sea. But traditionally, it was like this Germanic sort of nation state that everyone spoke German. Like the common folks were typically Latvians that spoke Latvian, but all of like the clergy and the merchants and the barons and sort of like the landed, gentry, the landed class were German. But they were usually people that had been there for 700 years. And where they originally came from was there was a Northern Crusade that the
That's right.
church sponsored, where I believe what happened was there like this local duchy in Latvia and what we call now Latvia and Estonia, where they were having troubles with basically tribal peoples, like tribal Latvians, tribal Estonians, tribal Lithuanians, and they called on these Germanic knights they're called the Brethren of the Sword, and they basically called on them to come sort of protect them from these sort of rampaging pagans, and so these Brethren of the Sword, this Germanic sort of knight class, essentially invaded this area, sort of suppressed or put down all of these pagan tribal peoples, forced some to convert to Christianity, and then ended up just settling there. And this is like in the 1100s, 1200s,
Mhm.
and those are the first Baltic Germans. They basically had been there from the 1100s, 1200s, all the way until just after World War One. So it's crazy. They've been there for basically 700 years. Still speaking German, still maintaining that German identity, and intermarrying a little bit with the locals. But Baltic Germans now, if you try, even you could ask a German what a Baltic German is, they may not even know, because they're basically sort of been an erased people. They don't exist anymore, really, in any significant number, right? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, but that's more or less kind of where they came from and sort of where are they now, right?
Yeah, that's almost yeah, that's exactly where they came from. And the guy who wrote the song, Menteufel Katzdangen, he could trace his lineage in the Baltics for hundreds of years. And to have your roots that far into the ground, that's what motivates you to write such a poem of loss. And many of the Baltic Germans during that time lamented that the people in mainland Germany didn't know anything about him. And I mentioned in one of my articles, Heinrich von Höhne, he was quite upset, because he was arrested, because he assumed to be a Russian spy in Germany, and because the people in the German Empire just didn't know anything about Baltic barons, even, or Baltic Germans, even back then, let alone now.
That's wild. Like even their contemporaries didn't know who they were,
Right.
but they like so much of this song and this history is based in like someone's identity and how it's tied to the land that they're on, and being torn away from that and what that does to your identity. That's really interesting.
I think something else to add context to this is that Germany as a country, as we understand it, didn't become Germany until 1871. So, what, 30 years, 40 years before World War One? So, Germany was new at the time. There's a new concept. Before that, it was basically all these different like duchies and kingdoms and fiefdoms, all these things. And so, the largest one being Prussia. And so, in 1871, Prussia basically forcibly took all the German principalities around themselves, unified them, and said, okay, now we're Germany, whether you like it or not.
Right.
And so it's this idea of being German, but not necessarily from Germany, is kind of something I think maybe as Americans, like modern people may not quite grasp,
Right.
because this is the idea of a united Germany of German people is kind of a recent thing, right?
Yeah.
1871.
And I think our concept of, like, when I brought up identity, I think our concept of identity and personal identity and stuff like that would be so foreign to them. Like,
Yes.
it's just a given for them. It's not something that you can choose. It's not even something you'd think about or it's, yeah, maybe you have more to speak on that, Nim.
The Baltic Barons enjoyed a very complex identity, actually, and because of its complexities in this period, you actually see the introduction of deconstruction theory and things like that. The Baltic Barons were very cosmopolitan in nature, and they were very aware of it. Most of these guys, they would travel all through Europe studying various different things, art, music. Most of them spoke several languages, immensely interested in global, international esotericism. While they considered themselves ethnically German, they were part of the Russian Empire. Even their own perception of their own identity wasn't as as clear as a modern German might even have. They didn't have clean and cut identities either, and the lack of a clean and cut identity made it sort of difficult for them, and they were reluctant to leave the Baltics because that's the only place that their cosmopolitan identity made sense. Because it wouldn't make sense if you tried to explain it to someone within the German Empire or the mainland of the German Empire.
Right. Is that what they were fighting for? Like to prolong their, like, their we keep using the word identity, their stake in that, like, physical location?
Yeah, I mean, well, these people had estates there, palaces, large amounts of land,
Mm.
and all of that eventually got taken away from them.
And who took it?
Well, they were taken by Bolsheviks eventually, and nationalist movements within the Baltics.
Okay.
It's kind of interesting if you look now at any sort of like a historic building, castle, palace, anywhere in like Estonia, Latvia, parts of Lithuania. Virtually all of them, no exceptions, were built by Baltic
Yeah.
Germans hundreds of years ago, and they're massive and they're absolutely beautiful, and they're very Germanic in the way they look. And they some of them were burned down, some were rebuilt, but all the huge ones, like all the touristy ones you're going to go see, virtually all of them were built by Baltic Germans, who again, people that basically no longer exist.
Yeah, German identitarianism only began in the Baltics in reaction to the Bolsheviks movements and the independence movements of the region.
Oh, so it wasn't even needed until it was challenged, type thing?
Right. So Manteuffel Katzdangen himself was a patron of Estonian artists and Estonian musicians. So were a lot of the Baltic barons. They patronized Estonian, or rather Latvian schools and Latvian art. It wasn't until the 1905 revolution where the Latvian nationalists and the Bolsheviks burned down their houses and their estates that German identitarianism became a necessity. German identitarianism was seen as the only way to preserve their existence within the Baltics.
Right. Okay. Well, cool. Guys, do you think is that enough context to start getting into the song?
It'll never be enough context.
Is there? Well, I'll ask Nim. Is there anything else you want to give as far as a background before we hit the lyrics?
We could cover the fry chords a little bit. I think that might be
totally
important for it.
Yeah, hit it, dude.
Okay. Where do I start?
Freikorps is German for free core.
Yeah. Yeah. So. Okay, I think I know where to start.
Yeah, let's get into the etymology. What does it mean to be free?
Just start. So World War I just ended. Germany lost. Go.
So World War One just ended. Germany lost, and amongst the men of the now defeated German army were very complicated feelings of loss and betrayal and hopelessness. So after the return to Germany, a lot of the men decided that these guys were soldiers. This was sort of all they, for a lot of the younger guys especially, this is all their adult life ever knew. So they decided that they had to do something about the creeping of Asian Bolshevism into Europe. And eventually they created these groups called the Freikorps, which pretty much just means voluntary groups, Free Corps. And they set out to various locations. These Freikorps covered everywhere: internal conflicts within Germany, within Poland and the Baltics. And in this specific case, several groups of Freikorps went to the Baltics in order to defend that area, the Germans there, and even mainland Germany from Bolshevism.
Okay, I assume they were paid. Who was paying them?
So that's very interesting. So the pay came in promises to the soldiers that after they've completed their service, they would receive land in the Baltics that they could start a farm on or a settlement on. And these land promises came mostly from the Baltic barons. And even Manteuffel Katzdangen himself offered land in return for the service of the men.
Dang. So they were obviously working under the assumption that they would still be there when it was all over. So they were kind of writing checks that they couldn't fill a little bit.
Well, there was a agreement between the German government and the Latvian government that in return for protecting Latvia from Bolshevism, the Latvian government would give citizenship and land to the Germans who were fighting for them.
Oh, so they'd even get citizenship where they were, where they would be planted. Okay.
That's right. But eventually the Latvian government went back on its promise, and the Freikorps lost. The Freikorps operated with the tacit consent of the Entente. The Entente agreed because they had no way of protecting that area from Bolshevism. They agreed to allow the Germans to fight and protect that region. But afterwards, the Germans proved a little too effective in taking that area back from Bolshevism. The Entente got scared, so they removed their consent eventually, and the Latvian government went back on its promise, and most of those men never saw a penny or a square foot of land.
Wow. So they cleaned up Latvia. They cleaned up the Bolsheviks, whatever force was there, and then they didn't get any compensation.
More or less.
Dang. So the Latvians are the bad guys in this, it sounds like. Or the Latvian government. I shouldn't say the Latvians.
Well, that's a complicated moral question.
Okay, yeah, you're right.
Well, and one reason is because the Latvian government had only existed for like 10 seconds at the time this happened. Because before that, they were part of Russia, they were part of Prussia, they're part of all these different things. And I was asking my wife before the show, I was like, honey, do you know how many countries went into World War I versus how many came out of it?
That's right.
There were so many countries that just plain didn't exist at the end of World War I. One of them being the country that started World War I, Austria-Hungary, right? That empire no longer existed, but their main ally, Germany, did, which is why Germany got hit with the bill, all the blame for World War I. Even though they didn't start it, they were just there for their allies. But all these little Baltic countries like Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Yugoslavia, all these places came out of World War I with these new independence movements and these sort of nationalistic movements. Russia no longer existed. It was now Soviet Union, right? That happened. That's how Russia got out of World War I, is because they basically had this communist revolution where they killed the Tsar and set up their new government and then started sort of eating all the smaller states next to them. But it was this crazy, divisive time where everyone and their mother is like, hey, I want to have my own country. And so all these little tiny countries that can't even defend themselves start springing up from these old sort of the decaying bodies of these old empires.
But it's interesting because like the baggage around that is that there are people that are living on that land, and so it's like, what did, and it seems like it keeps coming back to this, but what do they identify as? What I'm sure that came into a big part of the story here is like, what about the Latvians? What did they think about the promises that their government was giving to the Freikorps that never came to fruition? But I'm sure they knew about their agreements, right? But what do you know anything about that? The locals?
So the existence of the Baltic barons definitely created a ethnic hierarchy within the region. So most of the Baltic barons never bothered to learn Latvian, or if they did, it was incredibly broken Latvian. The Latvians were often part of the estates. They worked on the estates of the Baltic barons. I mean, as for their participation in nationalist movements, the nationalism of that time was formed by Bolshevism. And Bolshevism has had the same hold on people that it does right now. Their identities were wielded by Bolshevism, and they received false promises of what Latvian and or Baltic independence could do for them.
Right. Okay. And yeah, this is kind of during like a transition time from like going from a more very hierarchical society to a more like maybe representative democratic like stuff. So it's like this kind of messy in between time where
Well, to a
they
Marxist
they didn't have
society, really.
Sorry, what was that?
To a Marxist society.
Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah, because the Bolshevism was kind of the driving force pushing the older style. I'm not sure what to call it. Like, I don't know what would you call it that the Bolshevism was pushing out.
Bolshevism. I mean, it was Marxism ultimately.
Yeah, that was kind of the new thing. So they're pushing the aristocracy, I guess, out.
The bourgeoisie.
Yeah, exactly. And that was mostly the Germans, right? Or the Baltic Germans. Okay.
It was whoever the educated, wealthy class were. But it's interesting that you bring up, Scott, like this transition period. That's exactly what it was, because all of a sudden, like the war is over, and now it's like, hey, everyone gets a country. It's like Oprah. It's like you get a country, and you get a country, and you get a country. And then the Bolsheviks were like, whoa, okay, hold on now, comrade. How about there's no country at all, and you all just, share everything? But it's interesting that, because Nim, you brought up earlier the 1905, kind of the first Russian Revolution. I think they call it the first revolution, I think. Yes. But that was a revolution in Russia that happened shortly after the Russo-Japanese War. And part of the reason it happened is because Russia basically got their trash kicked by the Japanese, which was like this huge slap in the face to the entire Western civilized world. But the Tsar, one of the things that he implemented was, okay, hey, you guys, you Russians, you want a democratic government? Here's the Duma. You can have an elected sort of almost like a parliament, right? Mm-hmm. But he still kept himself as the head, and he literally declared himself as head autocrat, and he could veto anything the Duma did. And so ultimately it didn't work. But it's interesting because after this whole 100-year period of getting rid of the Tsar, Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union ended, guess what they called their new government? The Duma. That's what Russia's government is nowadays. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely this transition period where all of a sudden people are like, you know what? I want to be able to like vote and stuff. But then you also have this whole Bolshevism thing basically just taking over everywhere and kind of starting in Russia and kind of moving out across the world. One thing that's interesting about the Freikorps, and correct me if I'm wrong, Nim, but it seems like they fought for different people and almost different causes, different countries, different entities. But it seems like the one unifying thing is they all just hated communists. It's like they fought against communism wherever it was found, basically.
Yeah, that was the goal of most European countries at that time, was to block the spread of Asian Bolshevism into Europe. And by far, the most effective force in that were the German Freikorps. To a large extent, Europe has the Baltic Freikorps to thank for protecting Europe from Asian Bolshevism.
Yeah, it seems like they were like the front lines of keeping the incoming Russian communism out, right?
Absolutely.
That's interesting, and the most interesting part about it is how forgotten they are. And yeah, that's your good work is bringing that to light more and more. I think that's pretty dang important. So let's now that we know who the Freikorps is, and kind of what they were doing, what their goals were. They honestly, I'm getting like hints of previous episode with Roland, the headless Thompson
That's
gunner.
what I was thinking
right?
too.
Right?
They're all rolling the headless Thompson gunner,
Yeah,
man.
they
live on in the
what is it?
Freikorps.
They heard the burst and now they bought it, right? They bought the gun.
Yeah, exactly. Call back.
Go listen to Roland the Headless Thompson Gunner
Episode 2.
Yep. All right, so let's get into the lyrics, and they're pretty kind of downer lyrics, but it makes sense based on what we've learned. Like, I mean, most things in this part of the world at that time is going to be pretty downer, but that's okay. All right, who wants to start?
Anything dealing with communism is always depressing.
It is.
So the Grenzwacht
out.
hielt im Osten is the name. Nim, how do you translate the title of the song? Because it's translated several different ways.
Yeah, I mean, the border watch stops in the east would be pretty close. A good translation, I think.
Yeah, that's kind of what I saw. I've seen also the border guard halted in the east,
Yeah.
border watch held in the east. I've seen different ways of writing it, but basically what it is whoever's guarding the borders, the border watch, the border guard, that they stopped in the east. In this case, east of Germany being,
The
Poland,
Baltic region.
essentially.
Yeah.
Baltics, yeah. So anyway, go ahead, man. So why don't we start picking apart the lyrics here for our listeners? We're only going to do the English lyrics, mainly because none of us are fluent in German, and because it'd be an extra long episode if we did both of them.
Yeah, and the only version of the actual song we have is in German, I believe, and so when you listen to it, just enjoy the sounds of the German language with the beat behind it. So, but as far as like now, we have the privilege of reading it in English. All right, I'll kind of start reading. If you have anything to add, just stop me. The border watch held in the east, long against the enemy. Today their last post returns back to the fatherland. So, what point is this referencing?
Well, it's like Nim was saying. So he's writing this after his estate was kind of like burned down by communists, essentially, and then he's rebuilding it. And I think he's almost like hearkening back to like the border watch held in the east long against the enemy. Because again, as Nim said, this guy can trace his lineage to living in this land outside of Germany for hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And they've kind of been sort of holding their own against various different enemies, whether it was like marauding tribal peoples, or whether it was, nationalist movements of Latvians, or whether it was communists. They've sort of held the line this whole time.
Right. And they're finally pushed back. Well, are they pushed? So they're pushed back to their fatherland, back to Germany.
Yeah.
Weary and decimated in true knighthood, the best have stayed. Us others lacked the strength. I'm not sure how well that's translated, but yeah.
Just the language of the knighthood, because the Baltic Germans first appeared here as actual knights in the Livonian Crusades. And
so they're hearkening back to that tradition. They saw themselves as knights. Is that what it's getting at?
I think they did, and this time period is something I've studied a lot. This kind of World War I time period, because it's a time of moving from the old world to the new world. And so if you look at, like, for example, the French, for example, when they entered World War I in 1914, they were still going off to war wearing the exact identical outfits that the guys going to fight with Napoleon 100 years earlier were wearing. And so again, it's this whole idea of like we're knights, like on horseback, because in World War I, people were still fighting on horseback. The Freikorps, a lot of them were on horseback. They had cavalry units, right? And so this idea of being a knight wasn't something, I don't think it was something like nowadays where we think of like, oh, he's like a white knight, he's a gentleman or whatever. Like, these guys were straight up like, no, we are descended from knights. We're descended from the brethren of the sword. And to give a tad bit more context to that, the Brethren of the Sword was this Livonian crusade, like Nim said, that conquered this area, tamed this wild land, settled it with their families and kind of grew there. But they were later defeated in battle. Most of them were. And whoever was left of the Brethren of the Sword actually joined the Teutonic Order of Knights, another Germanic, sort of knighthood. But what's interesting is the Teutonic Knights still exist today. There's actually a Grand Master of Teutonic Knights straight up in Germany now, and he's like the 66th Grand Master of Teutonic Knights. Now, it's purely religious now and has been for the past 200 years. But it's a little bit interesting that this idea of knighthood, of Germanic knighthood, it still persists in some small way from all the way back to this time period.
Yeah, I think the modern Teutonic Order also does like charity work and things like that. But
yeah, it's kind of like another Catholic organization, I know, but it's still kind of
they're not waging war anymore.
Yeah, their military
lost their edge.
It's just dormant. It'll come back maybe.
They're waiting on the Pope to call the next crusade, man. Then they're ready to go.
Yep. All right, who wants to take over reading the lyrics?
I can, because on verse 2, because I have a question about this one for Nim.
Cool.
So verse 2, it says, they're leaving the east and they're heading to the fatherland. And it says, but we bring the banner that waved before us in battle from Riga's bloody plain in all its honor. The battle-scarred flag never bows for an enemy, and today and always points the way east. Now, I know Riga is a city that's still around today. It's the capital of Latvia, and I know there's many battles there, hence the bloody plain.
Mm-hmm.
The banner is referring to a flag that these guys carried, and what they're basically saying is, hey, our rear guard, the last of our soldiers, the last of our knights fleeing our homeland in the east, is bringing the flag back with them. So my question is Nim, do you know, or do you have a theory on what flag they're talking about? Because there's several different flags for this time period for these people, and I'm curious if you know, or if you have a theory on what flag they're talking about, because I honestly don't know.
I would assume that it's the German flag of the time, because most of the men who fought in the Baltic Freikorps were German nationalists, and the Baltic Barons had also become German nationalists. Riga, in this case, Riga is referring to most likely the battles that happened in 1919. Starting on May 22nd, which was the coup de Mai in Riga by the Baltic Freikorps, which was on that day the Baltic Freikorps took over Riga from the Bolsheviks. So it would have been a flag that would have been common during 1919.
All right, and it says it bows for no enemy. It bows for an enemy. What's that translation like? The battle-scarred flag never bows for an enemy. Yeah, never bows for an enemy.
Never bows for an enemy. That's
Nice.
right.
Yeah.
And today
and always points way east.
Yep, today and always points.
Almost like it's a reminder. It's like, hey, we brought this flag back to the fatherland with us. Take it back to its ancestral homeland in the east. Almost is kind of what it's getting at.
Right. The assumption was always that Baltic Barons or Baltic Germans would eventually return to the east, to the Baltics.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about it from my perspective. Someone that's like, it's hard as a modern American to think of time in the way they did back then, because they've been there, their family's been there for hundreds of years, 700 years, 800 years, however long. My family has been in where I'm living, has been here for since the Utah pioneers settled Utah. My family's been here, and so I feel very connected to this land, and that's only like, I don't know, 150 years. It's not, yeah. But multiply that by 4, 5.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that I don't think I have a real grasp on what it meant for them. To be kicked out of their land.
It's a foreign concept for Americans, because like you've been here, same as me, Scott, like several generations, right? Because of pioneers and everything.
Yeah.
But for Americans, that's a long time.
Yeah.
You've been here for 200 years, whatever. That's a long time for an American. But like you said, for these Baltic Germans and other peoples around the world, it's like, okay, that's child's play. I've been here for almost 1,000 years, bro.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? Like
exactly.
it's a crazy amount of time. So sorry, Nim, I think you're going to say something. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I mean that's pretty much what made this song so important to me. The hundreds of years of investment in this land, of building estates, patronizing the arts, cultivating the land, and it all sort of gets taken away from you by Bolsheviks, and that's an eternal story, right? People
Hmm.
create something really good, and then communists come and ruin it.
They say, no, that's mine.
Yeah.
I want that. What you built, it's really awesome, and you're enjoying. And because of your beliefs, it became what it is. I want it.
Yeah, and they could never do anything remotely similar to the people that they destroy.
Hmm. Oh, totally. No. It's like they can't create. All they can do is take.
That's right. And the Freikorps, more than any other group, recognize the damage that Bolshevism and communism does to a people. Walter von Meeden, who was one of the leaders of one of the Freikorps, the Meeden Freikorps, that participated in the 1919 coup in Riga, he reflects on the damage that the November Revolution, had on Germany, because when he left for war, he developed a camaraderie with his battery. He was the captain of the battery, and on his return in his memoir, all he can talk about is interacting with these, what he would call like red sleeves or Novemberlings, and all the interaction with them was just miserable, because they were mutiners, they were deserters, they were weak men, they cared for nothing else but their own. They went around attacking old people, and all they would do is destroy. And that became that the return from the First World War to the homeland became a point that motivated a lot of the men who participated in the Baltic Freikorps to do so, because they witnessed how Marxism and Bolshevism had completely ruined their own people and the mentality of their own people. So they saw it as an imperative to go east and protect Germany and protect all of Christian Europe.
Well, it's like you said, Scott. Like communism is based on allegedly taking from the haves and giving to the have-nots. Right? That is it. It builds nothing. It contributes nothing. All it does is take from those that have created or contributed and give to those that haven't.
Right.
And expects a benefit from that.
Right. Yeah. It's very short-sighted. Like what happens when the production that the haves have enjoyed is gone. Like what happens when that's gone? But
Well, that's because real communism hasn't been tried yet, man.
that's true.
That's why. So, Nim, do you want to take verse? We only have 4 verses in this thing. Do you want to take verse 3 then?
Sure. It rushes forth to admonish its forefather's spirit. Despite all misery and hardship, the German future calls. Have we also become strangers, you brothers of the Reich? From west and south and north, the banner stays the same. This is why I think he's probably talking about the German flag, right? From west and south and north, the banner stays the same. And in the stanza previous to that, he's reflecting that we have become strangers to you, brothers of the Reich. What had happened was that as we talked about earlier, after the Freikorps succeeded in liberating Riga from Bolshevism, eventually the German Empire had to relinquish support for the Freikorps. So they were no longer supported by the German government or the Entente. And the feeling was amongst the Freikorps and the Baltic barons was that we have been left alone to fend for ourselves now. The Germans no longer had the legal authority to operate within the Baltics.
It's interesting here that they say, the German future calls, and later on, you brothers of the Reich. Reich is the German word for kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone knows that Germany under Hitler, he called the Third Reich because he kind of sort of rewrote some of the German history and kind of said there's these three German stages of history. There's the First Reich, the Second Reich, and now we're in the Third Reich, which is going to persist for 1,000 years. That was his idea, right? But this didn't originate with Hitler. That was not his idea.
No.
Because this song predates Nazis, Nazi Germany. Hitler was alive, so he had been familiar with this because he's a contemporary of the guy writing this. But this idea of like a German kingdom that may not necessarily be a country, right? Because a country is a new idea. Germany is a new idea here, but this idea of like German peoples are all united under this kingdom throughout the world, kind of this pan-Germanism, if you will. It's kind of an interesting thing to hear from somebody writing from 1919 or 1918, you know?
Yeah, Reich was a pretty common word used at that time to denote the idea of Greater Germany.
Right, and the other interesting part of this verse is, and it's kind of sad, but they're being called back to their fatherland, but even in their fatherland, they've become strangers. Like
That's
they're going back to their brothers of their kingdom, but they're strangers in their fatherland. And so it's the west, south, and north are all kind of united in a way. Where they were in the east were cut off, and now they're bringing back in. And so now they don't really have a home. They're back with their brothers, but they're not really home.
Yeah, I mean, the question he's pondering is that we've become strangers to you. You no longer support us. But from the west, south, and north, the banner's the same. We're all Germans. So why have we become strangers to you?
Mm-hmm. All right, now we'll go into verse 4. Whether we also perish here, that doesn't bother you. To bequeath the flag is our last duty. I may no longer hesitate. Surely they will force your mind to carry it to the Eastland. It must go there. To carry it to the Eastland, it must go there. So it's still talking about the flag, right?
Yeah,
It's like a passing the torch moment.
that's right. That's exactly what it is. The Eastland refers to the entire Baltic region, obviously.
And when it says whether we also perish here, that doesn't bother you. I'm assuming that's saying whether we perish here in Germany, it shouldn't bother you. You should take it. Now we're passing the torch. It's your responsibility to take it east again. Is that what it's saying?
Right.
Like
That's
speaking to
right.
the future? Okay. Future generations.
That's all. Yeah, that's all it's about, is ensuring a survival for German identity within the Baltics for future generations, because they had already been there for 700 years or so.
Right. And to bring it back home, I suppose. I talked about where I live has historical family context to me. If I were ever pushed out, I would want my future generations to come back here to do the same thing. Like if I have to die in some foreign land, I want my kids or their kids or whoever to go back to our land. I totally resonate with that.
So, Nim, I got a question for you, man. Now that we've gone through the whole song, and we'll play it at the end of the podcast. So, this song was a poem
That's right.
written by this guy, you know, Karl Freiherr Manteuffel Konstangen, and the original title of the song, or excuse me, the original title of the poem was Die Balten Fahne,
Mm-hmm.
which is the Baltic flag.
Yep.
Now, as far as I know, Karl Manteuffel Konstangen, he was a poet, but he was not necessarily a musician. Is that right? And if so, when was this set to music, or do you know where this tune came from? Because every cover I've heard of this song used the exact same tune, and I'm curious where that tune came from. Do you know?
I'm not aware where the tune came from, actually, but yeah, Karl Manteuffel Konstangen was just a poet. Although he did live to see his music perform, or his poetry performed in music halls. And it was very weird at that time to have a governor of who he was the administrator in Kurland, who was a poet. And he reflects that previously, like in his father's days, that wouldn't have been possible or respectable. but things were changing when he became administrator.
Yeah, because I was reading about the guy. He was born in like the 1870s, like the mid 1870s, and he lived all the way to 1946. So he lived through both world wars.
Yeah.
It's amazing to see to think like he was born literally 5 years after Germany came into existence, and he watched Germany go through both world wars and basically be almost not exist after the Second World War. I can't imagine like just the things that this guy saw in his lifetime that happened to his people.
Yeah, the Manteuffel family was one of the most influential families in the Baltics. Hans Manteuffel, he sort of led the coup de May on May 22nd. And of course, Hazo Manteuffel, he became an important historical figure as well, who worked in the Wehrmacht and then eventually came to the United States and taught military strategy. The Manteuffel family, undoubtedly one of the most influential and important families of the region.
Yeah, and that estate that you were talking about earlier that was burned down during that first revolution, he had it rebuilt.
That's right.
But after all the Baltic Germans left, that estate still stands. That estate's still there.
Absolutely, and you can go visit it, and you can go visit the empty estate.
It's empty? There's no one living there?
As far as I'm aware, no one lives there anymore. It's part museum now, pretty much.
Interesting.
I was going to say, this original estate, I was reading about it earlier. It was built in like 1800. And then in like 1905, it was burned down. But then Manteuffel Kotzdagen, he had it rebuilt to like the exact specifications that it was before.
Yeah, very.
And and this rebuilding of this estate was what brought him so much joy and we think inspired this poem. But I think it was actually destroyed again during World War I or World War II, and then rebuilt again. But it's but like I said, it still stands in the same spot, and I think it's still called, if I'm not mistaken, Nim, correct me if I'm wrong, it's still called the Kotzdagen estate or manor.
I believe it is. Yes, and it is in
the name lives on.
Rural Latvia. If anyone wants to go visit it.
Well, cool. Thanks, Nim. And this is a great song. I know you kind of talked about it earlier, but I mean, I'm assuming you discovered this song in your research, and I know that there's other songs that you've sort of kind of stumbled upon that are sort of in this vein. Mm-hmm. What made you pick this song today for this episode? I'm curious.
This song was pretty much what inspired my interest in the Baltic region and the Baltic Freikorps. This was the beginning of this adventure for me.
Interesting. That's awesome. Did you first encounter it as a song or as a poem?
I first encountered it on YouTube as a song.
Nice.
It's sort of a popular song on YouTube. It has a couple million views.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Yeah,
we were talking about that. The link that you sent us for this song has like 7.5 million views.
Right.
I mean, it's doing some numbers, and there's a couple different versions of it that are even on Spotify.
Yes.
Not the one you sent us. I don't think it is, but there's a bunch of different versions with the same tune, same lyrics on Spotify.
Yeah, it was an important piece for the Baltic Germans and the Baltic Freikorps. I mean, it was archived in Ernst von Salomann's book, Das Buch vom Freikorpskämpfer, vom Deutschen Freikorpskämpfer, something like that. So it was important enough that Ernst considered it an imperative to include it in his sort of historical preservation work of the Baltic Freikorps.
So they had their reasons for preserving it. What do you want our audience to get out of this song and this story?
I want the audience to understand the struggle against Bolshevism. That Bolshevism always seeks to destroy what better people create.
That's good. That's simple. I like it.
Agreed. Amen. So, Nim, we really appreciate coming on the show, man. We hope that you find more of these sort of, golden nuggets of historical significance here, and you want to come on the show again. But before we kind of end everything, is there anything that you want? Where can people find more about your work? Is there anything that you want to plug before we sign off?
You can find me on Twitter at AnchorStill. That's AnchorStill. And from there, you can find everything else. You can find the NIM stack.
Yeah, we'll link your Twitter and the NIM stack and anything else we need to link to the song and all this stuff in the show notes. So scroll down a little bit and look at that. But yeah, thanks, Nim. This is a great episode. Every episode we get to the end, it's like, oh, this is my favorite episode. This is like the best. It was really good. Like I said, looking at history from this point of view, because I'm always looking at it from a Western point of view, from even as far west as America, obviously. But looking at it from more of an Eastern view, it's been really eye-opening and really cool. So yeah, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. With that, we'll have the song play us out, and we will see you all in the next episode.
Die Grenzwacht hielt im Osten, dem Feinde lange stand. Heut kehrt ihr letzter Posten zurück ins Vaterland. Erschöpft und aufgerieben in treuer Ritterschaft. Die Besten sind geblieben, uns andern brach die Kraft. Doch bringen wir die Fahne, die wehen vor uns stritt, von Rigas blut'gem Plane in allen Ehren mit. Die Sturm bewährt sich nimmer, vor einem Feind geneigt, und heute noch und immer den Weg nach Osten zeigt. Es rauscht dorthin zu mahnen, zu ihr der Väter Geist, trotz aller Not ein Ahnen, das deutsche Zukunft heißt. Sind wir auch fremd geworden, euch Brüdern aus dem Reich, aus West und Süd und Norden, das Banner blieb sich gleich. Ob wir auch hier verderben, das kümmere euch nicht. Die Fahne zu vererben, ist unsere letzte Pflicht. Ich darf nicht länger zagen, bald zwingt sie euren Sinn, nach Ostland sie zu tragen. Sie will, sie muss dorthin. Nach Ostland sie zu tragen, sie will, sie muss dorthin.